new atheists failed to answer people's ultimate question. They held out science and reason as the ultimate way in which we should understand everything. But actually, science and reason are good for some things, but they won't tell you why you're here. They won't tell you your value. They won't lead to a meaningful, flourishing life.
Suppose it were true that atheism doesn't offer anything. So what?
Our kind of post-Christian ideology, humanist ideology, secular, liberal, whatever you want to call it, is actually rather anemic.
Something has changed in the tide of faith, that just maybe God might be surprising us.
Faith in a higher power, in God, and in the story that makes sense of it all, gives it meaning.
These are the ways in which we discover truth. It is through narratives, through myths. There is nothing more powerful than the Christian myth.
I believe we're at a turning of the tide moment. Yes, it's gone a long way out, and things may get worse before they get better, but I believe that tide is starting to turn. And the question is, will we be ready? Is the church ready to receive these people? These people who are the meaning seekers, who are going to be looking for a place to call home, a place to find meaning. I pray, my hope and prayer is that we will be ready, because I believe it's going to happen.
Hi, welcome back to the channel. I got to visit Dallas recently and discovered everything is bigger in Texas, from the Buc-ee's service station I visited, which was massive, to the barbecue and brisket, even the churches as well. Anyway, I had a blast speaking at a few churches during my time there, including First Baptist Garland, where I shared about why I believe our post-Christian culture is seeing a surprising rebirth of belief in God. So big thanks to the senior pastor, Dr. Greg Ammons, for the invitation and permission to rebroadcast here on my channel. Hope you enjoy this talk, plus a great Q&A with the congregation that followed it, many of whom had been listening to the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast, it turns out, and had read the book as well. Now, just before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube for more Thinking Faith conversations, and let me know what you think of the talk in the comments section. I'd love to see what you make of it. And if you'd like to support my work, you'll get early access to episodes, videos, bonus content, and gold supporters even get signed copies of both of my books. The links are with the info. Enjoy.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome I've already received since walking through the doors here at First Baptist. And I bring greetings, of course, from His Majesty King Charles III to all of his loyal subjects here in Texas. But we had a little falling out, didn't we, 150 years ago, but never mind. It's just so good to be with you. Thank you, folks, and really looking forward to sharing with you this evening. I want to begin by going right back 150 years, actually, to a poem that was written by the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold. And he wrote a famous poem called Dover Beach, including this particular stanza. I'll read it out for you. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar. I'm going to begin by depressing you this evening, I'm afraid, because this poem, this stanza from this poem, has often been quoted in our culture, and it has really been used to represent the idea that Christianity has gone out in the West. And Matthew Arnold, writing 150 years ago, which was actually the high point of church-going in the UK, well, you can see just how that's accelerated in our day, as science, as secularism, has produced a very post-Christian culture. And a lot of people quote this idea of the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, and they say, that's the story. Christianity will continue to recede in the West. We'll continue to see the decline of church-going, the decline of people calling themselves Christian. That's the end of the story. But I want to encourage you this evening that actually I don't think that's the end of the story. I had a conversation a few years ago with a really interesting thinker called Douglas Murray. He's a secular thinker. He's not a Christian. But when he came on my show, he said, Justin, you could call me a Christian atheist. A Christian atheist, I said. What is a Christian atheist? Well, the point is that Douglas Murray, he's a very successful journalist. He's associate editor of The Spectator. We were contemporaries at Oxford University, but he's gone on to much bigger and better things than I. But what he's realized is that even though he doesn't believe in Christianity, he realizes that all the values he holds were essentially came from the Christian story. And that's why he calls himself a Christian atheist. And he quoted to me this well-worn line from Matthew Arnold about the melancholy, long-withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And he said, look, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it could come back in again. After all, that's the point of tides. And he was saying this in the context of seeing a number of surprising examples in his own life of other secular intellectuals who were reconsidering Christianity. Even seeing some of his friends, rational thinking people, converting to Christianity from atheism. And I was seeing a very similar phenomenon to Douglas Murray, and it's really what led me to write the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because I was seeing a real sea change in the atmosphere around the conversation on faith. I began hosting conversations on faith about 17 or 18 years ago, when I began a show called Unbelievable with a question mark, where I brought Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. It was a wonderful experience, and it really began in the heyday of a movement called the New Atheism. This was in around the mid-2000s, and it was led by the four gentlemen that you can see on screen: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, known as the Four Horsemen of New Atheism. New Atheism was a very dogmatic, quite aggressive form of non-belief, and it rode high in the bestseller charts. Each of these gentlemen had a best-selling book against religion and against God. Perhaps the best known was Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. I remember in 2009, there was an atheist bus campaign in the UK. We had red London buses circulating the capital bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So this was a time when it was very trendy to be an atheist. And it was a time when religion was being disparaged, ridiculed, and dismissed by these kinds of folk. But I discovered over time that the conversations really changed. I was having these conversations on my faith debate program, Unbelievable, with these quite combative atheists opposite Christian thinkers. And over the years, I realized actually that Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. I discovered there's a really strong intellectual core to Christian faith that could stand up to the objections of the new atheist. But more than that, I started to notice that more and more of the non-believers who were coming on my show were actually distancing themselves from this very aggressive, anti-theistic form of atheism. They were saying, I don't believe in God, Justin, but I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. And the new atheist movement itself began to splinter and unravel internally for all kinds of interesting reasons. It appeared that once they had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, there was very little else they could actually agree on, because they started to splinter over where their movement should go. Some wanted to go in a very socially justice-motivated directions. Others wanted nothing to do with that. In the end, even Richard Dawkins got cancelled by his own movement because he was stripped of his Humanist of the Year award in 2021 by the American Humanist Association. Why? Because of his comments on transgender. These are the issues that split the atheist community down the center. And I watched with interest from the sidelines, seeing all this happen. But more than the internal meltdown that happened, there was also just the fact that I think the new atheists failed to answer people's ultimate questions. They held out science and reason as the ultimate way in which we should understand everything, the universe and ourselves. But actually, science and reason are good for some things, but they won't tell you why you're here. They won't tell you your value. They won't lead to a meaningful, flourishing life. You have to go elsewhere for those questions. And what I've noticed is that people have kind of abandoned today the New Atheist project. And we're seeing a very different kind of conversation, even in secular circles, around the value of faith. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about that this evening. As I say, I started hosting these conversations a number of years ago, and it was wonderful to be involved in them and to see all of these interesting intellectuals coming and going, and really seeing the way that actually Christianity could stand up for itself in the public square. And over time, I started to see some of these new thinkers emerge. This is just a picture of one example of them, and I'm going to come back to the gentleman on the right, Jordan Peterson, because he's a very interesting example of the changing nature of the conversation in our culture. If you want to read this in full, as Pastor Ammon kindly said, there are books available after the event, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But if you'd like to listen, perhaps in a bit more detail, to some of these issues, there's also an accompanying podcast documentary series, also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So if you're a podcast listener, that may be a place to go. But it's really detailing the change in the conversation and how the church can lean into this new moment in our culture. I want to give you 3 particular ways this evening that I've seen the conversation on God changing in recent years. And one of the best ways I think of doing this is to ask, what is the best explanation? I think there are at least 3 really good reasons why it makes more sense to believe in God than to believe in atheism. And this was one of the things I learned over the years of hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists, is that we all stand in a worldview of some kind. I may be a Christian over here, and I may have my beliefs, and yes, I need to defend them. But actually, my atheist friend over here also subscribes to a particular worldview. Most of the atheists I've met through the conversations I've hosted have been people who subscribe to something called naturalism. It's the idea that ultimately all that exists is matter in motion, the laws of the universe, blind material processes that give rise to everything. But actually, that has all kinds of implications. It means that the universe essentially came from nowhere and is heading nowhere. There's no ultimate purpose to life. All of the things we take for granted in terms of love, truth, beauty, justice, they're all ultimately illusions that are simply could be boiled down to the comings and goings of electrons in our brain. Now, that's an interesting worldview to hold, but it's one you're going to have to defend. So when I have a conversation with my atheist friend, I'm going to be asking them questions just as much as I hope they'll be asking me questions. And in the end, what I've discovered is that actually, when we look at the evidence that's available to all of us, the Christian worldview seems to make better sense of it. God is a better explanation in the end. And I'm going to give you these 3 ways in which I believe that's true, and talk about some of these interesting secular thinkers who are now speaking about these issues in our world. Firstly, I believe God makes sense of human existence. One of the things the new atheists, who were very often led by scientific figures, one of the things they wanted to say was that the more we know about science, the less reason we have to believe in God. Well, I believe the opposite is true. In the last 100 or so years, we have been given more and more reasons from science to believe in God. There's been an interesting move in the direction, even in the mainstream scientific community, to understanding that there's more to our universe and the fact that we're here in the universe than appears to meet the eye. One of the first extraordinary phenomena I encountered as I started hosting conversations between scientists who were Christians and non-believers was a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. Now, it's a bit of a mind-boggling idea, so I tried to boil it down into a 4 or 5 minute video just to get a sense of what we're talking about here. So just for 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to let the video do the talking, and then I'll come back and tell you about an interesting secular scientist who's also looking at the purpose behind the universe. You can roll the video.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
It's a phenomenal thing, isn't it? This fine-tuning of the universe for life. But it's absolutely the scientific consensus that this universe had to be precisely dialed in all kinds of ways to allow for you and I to be here. But it's not just Christian thinkers who are saying this. I want to introduce you to an interesting thinker called Paul Davies. He's a mainstream scientist. He works at the Arizona State University, head of their Origins project. Now, he is not a Christian, and he doesn't really use the word God much either. But he does say this. When I've had conversations with him, as he writes and talks about the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact there is a universe, that there was a Big Bang, the fact that there's life on Earth, and the extraordinary chemical complexity that it took for the first self-replicating molecule to come into existence, he says this. He says, Justin, the directionality in the universe going from matter to life to consciousness, and I would add comprehension to that, There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. Now, when Paul Davies describes that, it reminds me of a Greek word that conveys the idea of meaning coming out of disorder, of life being generated, of order being spoken into chaos. It's the Greek word logos. And of course, it's the word that is used of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John, the pre-existent word of God, the logos, speaking life into existence. And when I see the best science matched with what Scripture tells us about the word of God, the logos behind life, I think something interesting is happening in our culture at that point. That's why I believe that it makes more sense to believe in God when you look at human existence. It's very hard to understand how this could have all arisen by chance. And I think there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God happening even in the sciences today. So that's my first point. When it comes to human existence, it makes sense. God is the best explanation.
Hi, it's Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. The link is with the info below. Now, back to the conversation.
But I also believe God makes sense of human value. Human value, that's my next point. And this is where we, rather than look out there at the universe, we look within and we ask questions like, why do we believe in human value, human dignity? Why do we spend time enshrining human rights into bills and declarations and legal statements? I had a really interesting conversation several years ago with Richard Dawkins, probably the best-known atheist in the world. I'd attended a debate that he'd been part of at Oxford University, and shortly afterwards managed to get a short interview with him. And this question of human value came up, and how we can measure or understand our concept of human value and dignity on a purely atheistic worldview. And I want to read you exactly how our conversation went. I said to him, Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I responded, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say, the reason this is good is that it's good? And you don't have any way to stand on that statement. And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and I think you should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist like Richard Dawkins. He was being perfectly consistent with his worldview. So why do we respond in horror to the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that we happen to have been dealt by the socio-cultural forces of evolution? That doesn't seem right. It feels to me, and probably feels to you, that actually the way we treat other human beings, there are really right and really wrong ways of doing that. And it doesn't matter whether one culture develops a disregard for it or not. It's kind of baked in. It's not about just some random forces of culture and evolution. There's more to it than that. I think it only makes sense to me, this idea that we believe in human value, dignity, rights, if what it says on the first page of the Bible is true, that everybody, male and female, is created in the image of God. If that's true, it makes perfect sense of this idea of human value. Because if you're made in the image of God, you have infinite worth and infinite value. It's very hard to justify where that idea comes from on a purely atheistic worldview. Now, as I say, it's not only Christian thinkers who are pointing this out. I want to introduce you to Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor in the Marvel films, I'm afraid, but the historian Tom Holland. He's a wonderful guy. I've had the opportunity to interview him several times. He co-hosts probably the most popular history podcast in the world, The Rest is History, and he's told something of his own story in his best-selling book, Dominion. Because Tom Holland, having sort of grown up with a nominal Christian faith, it kind of sputtered out by his teenage years. But he went on to a very successful career after university, writing popular historical books. And he spent a lot of time standing in the sandals of the Greeks and the Romans. But the more he spent time in the Greco-Roman world, the more he realized how completely alien the values and culture were of the Greeks and Romans compared to his own. Because this world that he was standing in and researching was a world where slavery was an absolutely de facto part of the economy. It was a world where the lives of women and children were very cheap. It was a world where some people could be the sexual property of other people. If you were a senior Roman male, you could have your pick. And he wondered, why are my values, my beliefs in equality, dignity, compassion, progress, freedom, why are they so different to the Greeks and the Romans? Where did they come from? And he realized, I didn't get these values, certainly from the Greeks and the Romans. I didn't get them from science or atheism. There was a very specific place he realized they came from. They went back to a person called Jesus of Nazareth and the movement that he had established, and that in his name completely changed the world that Tom Holland now lives in. And Tom Holland said it to me this way. He said, look, Justin, I struggle to believe in Christianity, okay? I'm going to be honest with you. But when I look at the things I actually believe in, human rights, dignity, value, I realize that in almost every way I'm a Christian because I've been so shaped by the Christian culture that produced me. It's not just Tom Holland who's recognizing this and who's asking questions. Louise Perry, another fascinating secular thinker who I've had the opportunity to interview, she grew up kind of schooled in typical liberal Western feminism. And that was especially true when it came to her view of sex and relationships. You know, she was completely sold on the agenda of the sexual revolution, the kind of modern hookup, you know, do what you want as long as you're not hurting anyone else kind of culture that we now live in. But her views on this got really shaken when she spent time volunteering for a rape crisis shelter. And she suddenly started to realize that the sexual revolution hadn't been good for everyone, especially not women and children. She went on to write a book, a very well-researched book, not at all as a Christian, not at all as a believer, but just looking at it from a purely kind of social perspective. And she wrote about the way in which the sexual revolution had been so damaging for so many people. But she discovered something in the process of writing this book. She realized there was one historical institution that had actually put guardrails on especially male sexuality and had allowed the flourishing of women and children and families and cultures and whole nations. And it was this funny old institution called monogamous Christian marriage. And she suddenly found herself coming to remarkably Christian conclusions when it came to sex and ethics. And when people like Louise Perry and Tom Holland, secular historians, secular thinkers, start to come to remarkably Christian conclusions about where human value is based, something's happening in our culture. Both of them are on very interesting journeys, not just at an intellectual level, but at a personal level too. They've been attracted to this story. There's something about it that speaks to them. And I'm meeting more and more of these secular thinkers who are reconsidering the Christian faith. I think something's changed in our culture, and I think actually people are starting to see that you can only make sense of human value if there's a God. If there's a God who makes sense of it. That's why I believe it makes sense to believe in God. If you believe in human value, you should believe in God. So God makes sense of human existence, and God makes sense of human value. Finally, I believe God makes sense of human purpose. It's the why question. It's the question of meaning. And this is just rampant in our culture at the moment. I'm meeting so many people who are asking this question more and more. One of the reasons, I think, is because we're living in what a lot of psychologists call a meaning crisis in the West. The Christian story that once completely shaped our culture gave us a story about a God who created every human being in his image, gave you infinite value and worth, and how even though life is difficult, that God came in person to be with us in our suffering, and through his death and resurrection gave us an ultimate hope in the future. That story has shaped the lives of countless generations of people in the West. Now, as you lose that story, as our culture becomes increasingly post-Christian, the question is, well, what story will end up shaping people's lives now? G.K. Chesterton once said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing, they have the capacity to believe in anything. And the new atheists, when they were busy sweeping the Christian story off the public domain, I think they honestly thought that it would be replaced by some kind of scientific rational utopia. We'd all live in peaceful harmony as science and reason came to rule. They were deluded, frankly, because what happened as the Christian story got pushed out of view was that all kinds of other stories flooded in to fill the void. Because we need a story to live by. We are storytelling creatures. And if it's not the Christian story, then something else will fill that God-shaped hole. And today, we see people filling that void with all kinds of other stories. It might be a story about the progressive left and sexuality and identity, and that becomes someone's sacred story. That becomes the thing that they invest all their worth and their life in. It might be a story about politics and an ideology there, and that may be the thing that becomes someone's sacred story. We're meant to live in a story, but the problem is these stories end up bashing against each other, and we get the culture wars, and we get a society that's pulling apart at the seams, and we get a generation of young people who are not just living in a meaning crisis, but a mental health crisis because of all the demands that are being put on them, because they don't have a story that makes sense of their life any longer. That's why I believe we're seeing the rise of something very different in the God conversation. As the new atheism has waned, as it has failed to answer the big questions of life, I think we're seeing people now turn towards other secular thinkers. And this is where I come back to our friend Jordan Peterson. Now, if you're not familiar with him, he's a sort of quite eccentric Canadian psychologist, and he came to public attention in a big way in 2018 when I had him on my show. Not because I had him on my show, I should add, but because he was beginning to kind of really get a reputation, a bit of a cult following in Canada and elsewhere. And it was because he was a psychologist filling whole auditoriums, thousands of people turning up to hear him speak for 2 or 3 hours at a time on the book of Genexis. And, you know, I can think of some preachers who would give their right arm to have an auditorium full of people willing to hear them talk on the book of Genesis for 3 hours. But people were paying money to come and hear this psychologist talk about the Bible. And the reason I think they were doing that, especially young men, interestingly, is that they were looking for answers. Who am I? Where is my identity to be found in this confusing culture? And Jordan Peterson was not only answering in a smart, intellectual way, but he was also pointing them back to the Bible. He was saying, actually, if you're looking for the story of who you are and what matters in life, go and read the Bible. I was astonished when he came and joined me on my show. It's very hard to say exactly where he is on the faith spectrum. I asked him, do you actually believe in God, Jordan? And he said, as he often does, well, it depends what you mean by God. He's kind of difficult to pin down. But what I do know is this. He's been opening the door for a lot of other people to walk through to Christian faith. I've met a lot of young men for whom he's kind of given intellectual permission to take Christianity seriously. Now, Jordan Peterson takes a kind of very psychological approach to the Bible. And I'm not sure I agree with all of his takes on the Bible, but, as I say, he's kind of a gateway drug to Christianity. He's had an extraordinary influence on so many people. He's one of these prophets, I believe, from outside the church who are showing us that there's a real hunger in our culture for these kinds of answers. And he's not the only one. I don't know if anyone listens to the Joe Rogan podcast, but Joe Rogan is the most popular podcast host in the world. Millions of downloads every week of his podcast. Here's someone who 10 or 15 years ago was only really ever featuring the new atheists or those kinds of voices on his show. He has really changed. He's featuring a really interesting, diverse range of voices now, often Christians. And only a few months ago, he said on his show, I think it's probably a good time for Jesus to come back right now, the way our culture's heading. Joe Rogan has actually opened up in all kinds of interesting ways to the possibility that actually there may be a God. It's so interesting to see the journeys that are happening among some of these key influencers, some of these people who are just opening up to the Christian story again in our culture in ways that would have been hard to imagine 10 or 15 years ago, when they would have been laughed out of the room. But the atmosphere has changed. Something has changed in the tide of faith. I think we might just be at a moment when the tide is beginning to turn. This was perhaps brought home to me most clearly a short time after my book was published last year. So my book got published almost exactly a year ago in September 2023. And then just a couple of months later, I heard the story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, for those who aren't aware of her, she's a Somali-born woman who was raised in a kind of fundamentalist Islamic sect called the Muslim Brotherhood. And she fled Somalia for Europe to escape a forced marriage. And when she got to Europe, she completely rejected God and religion. In fact, she went on to write a best-selling anti-God, anti-religion book called Infidel. And she really joined the new atheist speakers. She was often on tour with them, sharing stages with them. She was good friends with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, those four horsemen. In many ways, she was the fifth horsewoman of the new atheism. Very much the most famous female atheist in the world. So imagine my surprise when in November last year, she wrote a viral article titled, "Why I Am Now a Christian." And here's the story. She explained in this article how she had come to realize that actually secular atheistic humanism cannot provide a bulwark against the major forces in our world, the Putins and the Chinas and the fundamentalist Islams and what she sees as the danger of woke ideology in our culture. She's come to realize, and she explicitly said she's been converted at an intellectual level by the Tom Holland thesis, who we mentioned earlier, that actually all our fundamental values that we want to defend in the West come from the Christian story, and that's the only story that can continue to guard them and to make them flourish. She says we're not going to have the fruits of Christianity without the roots of Christianity. Without that story, those fruits will one day wither on the vine, and they're already starting to do so. Now, a lot of people accused Ayaan Hirsi Ali of kind of essentially having a political, cultural conversion, but actually she went on to talk in her article, but also at length in a personal interview about her personal journey as well. And I was fascinated to hear this because it turned out that Ayaan Hirsi Ali for a number of years had been going through a personal meaning crisis. She couldn't see what the point of life was. Her atheist worldview simply didn't allow for there to be a purpose to life. She became very depressed, suicidal, alcoholic. She went through a number of therapists trying to find some reason. In the end, one of her counselors said to her, "Have you ever thought about praying?" And she said, of course not. I don't believe in God. I mean, the God I was raised with was a monster." And this counselor said to her, "Well, if you could believe in God, what kind of a God do you think you could believe in?" And she started to describe the kind of God she could potentially believe in. And she said, as I was describing it, I realized I was describing Jesus Christ. And she thought, well, maybe I don't need to go and invent a new God. Maybe I should investigate this person who claimed to be God. So she started going to church. She started praying. And she says it's completely turned her life upside down. God has turned her around, she says. She's had this remarkable conversion. Only a few months ago, she shared a stage in New York talking about it with her old friend Richard Dawkins. He was kind of very confused. He couldn't get it, but he couldn't deny that she had become a Christian. If it can happen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the most famous female atheist in the world, I think it could happen to anyone right now. I think we're living in some unusual times, some surprising times. I believe God is on the move in some really interesting and surprising ways. And I just want to encourage you this evening. We often get told a lot of negative things about the church. I live in a country where, as I say, the church has been in steep decline in terms of church going for many years. And a lot of people are saying, look, the sea of faith is going out, and that's the trajectory. That's the only direction things are going in. But I believe something's happening in our culture. People can only survive on the thin gruel of the atheist, materialist story of reality for so long, until suddenly they find themselves actually in need of a better story. And I think we're reaching that moment in our culture. And I just think that as we see all kinds of areas where human existence is pointing towards God, people looking for how we can make sense of human value are being led towards God, and people asking these ultimate questions of meaning and purpose are suddenly finding God. I find it really exciting and interesting that just maybe God might be surprising us, even in our generation. Because I believe in a God who constantly surprises us. When things look at their worst, that's the moment when God is about to act. Again, G.K. Chesterton has a wonderful quote where he says, "Christendom has died many deaths over the centuries, but it has always been reborn because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave." And I believe that's true today. We may feel kind of, disillusioned by the state of the church sometimes. We may feel very upset by the state of the culture, but I believe those are often the conditions under which God can do something surprising and new. And I think I'm just getting the sense that something's changed in our culture. I believe we're at a turning of the tide moment. Yes, it's gone a long way out, and things may get worse before they get better. But I believe that tide is starting to turn. And the question is, will we be ready? If you think of yourself as a Christian here tonight, and if you're part of a church, is the church ready to receive these people? These people who are the meaning seekers, who are going to be looking for a place to call home, a place to find meaning. I pray, my hope and prayer is that we will be ready, because I believe it's going to happen. God bless you guys. Thanks for listening.
Hi, it's me again. Just to say, if you want to support my work, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get signed copies of both my books and the chance for a monthly catch-up. The links are with the info. And now, back to where we left off.
Justin, thank you so much. Fascinating information and presentation. And that is an excellent question. Will the church be ready to receive those whenever they do turn to faith? Great question. We want to give you an opportunity to ask questions tonight. We have some microphones here. We are recording this. We're not live streaming it, but we are recording it. So if you do have a question, we ask that you come to one of the microphones to ask Justin before we close this evening. Who's going to be first? All right.
Justin, it's good to see you've been following your podcast for a really long time.
Oh, thank you.
So going exactly to that question, will the church be ready? And maybe I'm asking you to tease season 2, but because I think these sort of grandchildren of Nietzsche that are coming to faith, they're realizing that materialism is run out of gas, and they're asking that question about what is truth. Are we going to be able to fall back to the same question, the answers that we've given before? Well, the truth is what the church says. Truth is what the magisterium says. Truth is what Scripture says. But then we run into the question of, well, how do we interpret Scripture? So this question of, what is truth? Really old question.
Yeah.
How do you see this changing? How are we going to have to start thinking about truth differently or speaking about truth differently to reach this?
Yeah.
New population?
It's a great question. It's a very deep question. I think we do live in a generation that's been steeped in what you might call Enlightenment thinking. And it's got this view that ultimately we can kind of decide all questions of truth essentially through reason and through logic and through science and so on. But actually that's a very, in a sense, quite a modern way of thinking about truth. Obviously, what the Bible holds out as truth is not just an idea or an argument. It's a person. It's Jesus Christ. And for me, that's what we need to orient people towards, that actually you cannot make sense of life just by looking for truth in just this very narrow way of thinking about it as just an argument, a thing to be solved, okay? Because we'll all end up disagreeing with each other on that one because we're not God. We will never really ultimately understand life if that's our lens that we're looking at it through. But when we look at life through the lens of Jesus, who claims to be the truth, he kind of puts the world into focus for us. Now, that's going to be a big ask for a lot of people because it means kind of a complete change of their worldview. But actually, I think people are ready to hear a better story, a better way of understanding life, and the one that's found in the story of Jesus. I mean, it's going to involve a lot of people doing a lot of work, a lot of time, as people come with their questions and come trying to make sense of what this whole Christian worldview is about. But ultimately, people are living in some kind of a story about truth anyway. And when they find that the story they're already living in, this materialist atheist story of reality, just isn't ultimately making sense, I think they are going to be more open to the idea that, yes, truth has been revealed in Scripture and in a person, Jesus Christ. And ultimately, it's not just going to be a question of, can I trust this? Can I make sense of this at an intellectual level? It's going to be an experiential thing as well. That's especially, I want to emphasize that's what's been happening in the lives of a lot of the people who are actually turning to Christian faith. They're kind of going on an intellectual journey at one level, but the thing that always ends up tipping them in to the Christian faith, if you like, that last thing is always an experience of God in the way that Ayaan Hirsi Ali had. And that's truth at a different kind of level that you're encountering it. And that won't necessarily answer all the questions people have, but I think it's something far more fulfilling in the end when you encounter truth in a relationship with God rather than just this very narrow-minded idea of just trying to work out everything for yourself. I hope that helps in some way with that.
Very good.
Thank you.
Good. We'll try to
much.
get as many questions as we can in here. If you want to go next, and then we'll go over here to John.
Every author that you have had up there, I've read most of what the material is. My question to you, have you ever read any of David Horowitz's works that he's done?
Sorry, of who?
David Horowitz.
I know the name, but I haven't read much of his work.
Yeah, he did a book recently that's The Dark Agenda, and it points out to exactly what you're talking about, is that in America we have so much that's coming against what our founding was, but yet his book points back to everything. He's agnostic, but what is interesting was that everything in America was founded on Christian principles.
That's really interesting to hear. I'm finding more and more people who are kind of at some level touching on this thesis. And it's very often, as you say, people who are agnostic, people who don't necessarily claim a faith, but they're just recognizing that we've lost something. And they're recognizing that actually throwing out the Christian story is ultimately quite detrimental to the West. So thank you. I'll look into his work as well.
Another question is, do you know Hatun Tash?
Yes, the evangelist to Muslims wonderful woman. Yeah, very
She's
brave.
phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you. God bless you.
Yes,
Thank you.
John.
Justin, appreciate your presentation, quite fascinating. And I've been listening to Joe for a while, and especially Jordan Peterson, and I'm quite fascinated at his level of biblical knowledge. And I'm just curious, from your perspective or maybe direct knowledge, any idea how close to making the ultimate commitment
Jordan Peterson is, gosh, yes. Well, as I say, I follow his journey quite closely as well. And Jordan Peterson, he's very hard to pin down because, as I say, he does approach things through this psychological Jungian lens, you know. But what I will say is, looking at the people he's surrounded himself by, his wife has become a very committed Christian. His daughter Michaela has become a Christian. He's surrounding himself with Christian thinkers. He's doing these deep dives into now the book of Exodus and so on his channel. It feels like the net is closing in on Jordan Peterson in that sense. Now, ultimately, it's between him and God, you know, and we can't know exactly where his heart is. But what I will say, as I said earlier, is that wherever he's at on that journey, I do know that he's kind of opened the door for a lot of other people to walk through. And in a funny way, I think it's because he's not inside the church at this moment that people are more willing to give him a hearing. And so it's often, I think it's a case that God is using some of these, as I say, prophets from outside the church to kind of get the message out. And people are starting to realize, actually, this smart person who I follow on this podcast, hey, they might have something worth saying about Christianity. So thank you very much.
All we can do is continue to pray for
Absolutely.
him. Because the crowds that you mentioned, I've got a good friend that took his grandson to Jordan in Fort Worth, and it was a little over 20,000 people.
Yeah, it's
And
extraordinary.
It's
extraordinary.
amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank
Bless
you.
you.
Yes,
Thank
right
you.
here.
Justin, thank you so much for coming to Texas. On behalf of our state, I apologize for the unseasonably warm weather we've been having. I've often wondered why there's more believers here in Texas than many other states, and I think perhaps the reason why is that if you can survive a summer here, the idea of a literal hell perhaps becomes more of a plausible idea.
It could be true.
But I just wanted to say thank you. My sister sent me a link to your podcast this last May, and I listened to it. It was fascinating. I've been following you very closely. I've listened to all of the episodes since then. And I was encouraged by your compassion, your heart, and the wisdom by which you interacted with such interesting and some difficult conversations. And I felt personally challenged to start using my time better. And so I've engaged in an online discussion group for other people that are interested in Jordan Peterson's work. Many young men coming here that are, in challenging situations, and it's been. You encouraged me to be able to jump into conversations that would have perhaps before not jumped in.
That's just such an encouragement to me, because I think we do need to be open to having those conversations, and I'm glad it's encouraged you.
The question that I have for you is, did you see the article today in the New York Times?
I've read it.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
Okay, so the article I'm assuming you're referring to is this the research that's just shown that among a younger generation, Gen Z, now more men are turning up in church than women. And it profiles one particular Baptist church, I think, where that's happening. And this is really interesting. I've been following this. There's interesting pockets of this research elsewhere. In Finland, recent research showed a doubling in the number of young men attending church in recent years. And lots of people are really confused because traditionally, in the West especially, church-going has been primarily female. In my country, it's about, the average church is probably 2/3 female, 1/3 male. So what's going on in this younger generation? And I think it is very much linked to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon at one level, but that phenomenon itself is riding off a kind of male identity crisis in the West right now, and especially among young men. They don't know who they're supposed to be anymore because the culture has told them all kinds of confusing things. And I think a lot of them are finding an attraction towards Christianity because it kind of gives you an identity. It grounds your identity in something other than all the different messages of culture. And I think a lot of young men are just looking for something to make sense of themselves. And there's an extraordinary draw towards Christian faith. It's happening in multiple denominations, by the way. Interestingly, the Eastern Orthodox Church is seeing a boom in young men coming to faith, coming to their parishes. There's something really interesting happening, and I think it's to do with the male identity crisis. I'm planning a whole episode on this of the podcast, so look out for that.
Fantastic.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Let's do these 4 questions right here, 2 over here and 2 over here. And then if you have any others, you can see Justin after the service whenever he's signing books in our atrium. Forrest, let's go to you first.
You spoke about churches being ready to accept these new people. What do we need to do? What do you commonly see things we need to let go of or things we can change? How can you tell us to prepare ourselves?
It's such a good question, and it would require a really long answer, but very briefly, I would say this. The people who I think are going to be returning to church are people who are looking for a story to make sense of their lives, and they found the stories in the culture. They haven't worked. So I think rather than the church needs to be ready now to answer the questions that they're asking. And the danger is sometimes we end up answering the questions of a previous generation. So I spent a lot of my life answering the questions and objections of the new atheists when they were dominant in the culture. But that movement has essentially waned now. And the questions people are asking now, especially young people, are far more existential questions about meaning and purpose. And how do I get out of bed in the morning because I'm feeling depressed? They're not asking for a kind of philosophical proof for God in that sense. And I think what's important for the church to do is address those kinds of questions in the way it reaches out to people. And secondly, I think it does that not just through a kind of logical purely theological approach. I think we need to relearn the art of telling the story imaginatively. And I would point you to C.S. Lewis as a brilliant example of this, who did a wonderful job of logical, analytical ways of reaching people through his apologetics books like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain. But he probably reached the most people through his Chronicles of Narnia, which was an imaginative storytelling way of reaching people with the Christian message. And it's, I think, when you capture people's imagination, when, as it were, you make them wish that Christianity were true, then they're far more likely to be open to explaining why it is true. So I think the church needs to recapture storytelling, imagination, showing compellingly why people would want this story to be true. And that's going to happen in lots of different ways. But I would just say, you know, we need to capture that aspect of people's personality. And I think they'll be open to hearing the story when we do so. Thank you very much for your question.
Very interesting. Yes, Brian.
Thank you for coming over here. This is great. I've got about 17 questions.
I'll have to just take
but
one.
But you only have to answer one. So I was wanting to know, in answering the question of how the church can be prepared, it seems like one of the primary practices of the church that's really neglected in our time is hospitality and the community that comes around that. So I'm trying to think. I've heard your interview with Elizabeth Oldfield in the Unheard discussion, and maybe Rosaria Butterfield, you know, is another person who comes to mind. So do you see that, the idea of Christian community through hospitality rising as well as belief in God?
So having spoken to this gentleman, that is one of the imagination thing is one of the ways I think the church needs to meet people. One of the other main points I make in the book is exactly this: it's community. And it's a community that counters cancel culture as well, because I think we're living in a culture where people are not able to experience grace and forgiveness anymore, because it's a very censorious, judgmental kind of culture that we live in, where if you're not on my side, you're demonized, you're an outsider, you're a heretic. And people, I think, are exhausted by living in this cancel culture that we live in. And the church is the one place where you should be able to experience the opposite of that, because Jesus got cancelled on our behalf so that we could live in forgiveness and grace, and we extend that grace to anyone who walks through the doors and becomes part of this family. And for me, I think people are looking for that now. I think there's a hunger for that, because, and I think in an increasingly digital age as well, as people can live completely independently of other human beings by using their phone. I just was in San Francisco in the summer and had my first experience of a driverless taxi, which took me from A to B with no one else in the car. And it was kind of amazing and weird and fun, but it was also kind of scary, because I thought, is this the way we're heading, where we can live lives completely independently of each other? We'll never have to interact with another human being. I think that's going to be a disaster. And I think the church is fast becoming one of the few places in culture where you will find genuine human community. And it's messy and it's difficult, we all know that, but it's the one place where you'll actually grow as a human being, because Jesus is at the center of it. So I think absolutely community is absolutely essential as we welcome people in from the meaning crisis.
Very good. Awesome. Thank you, Raleigh.
All right, I'll be quick. I teach in the youth department here, and I have for 30-something years, 33, I think, years, something like that. And I'm going to touch on what that man said, the young man over there. I'm going to affirm him in the New York Times article, and you. Boys are dying to be men.
Yeah.
In a culture that says there's no such thing as men aren't really men. People make fun of me for not having a filter. It's say what it, but the boys love that.
Yeah.
The boys, they want to be a man, and they want to be a man the way the Bible describes being a man. And our culture doesn't say that. And I really believe that there are a lot of young men, especially in this church, who are revolting against that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason that you see men coming to church, is because they need to be men the way God made us to be men.
Yeah. And I agree with you on this. The danger is that in our culture, there are all kinds of things pulling on young men.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of men, young men particularly, looking for that sense of identity, but they're finding it in some of the really negative influences out there. So you guys may have heard of someone called Andrew Tate, who is this highly misogynistic kind of, whoever has the biggest harem kind of wins kind of view. And I've seen a lot of teenage boys gravitating towards those kinds of influences because they're looking for role models. They're looking for people who kind of offer a message of identity, but there's some really bad actors out there. And my hope is that, whether or not you agree with Jordan Peterson, at least he's pointing people back to Jesus, who is obviously the source of our identity, if we're male or female. But for me, he transcends some of those kinds of typical kind of macho type stuff that sometimes people try to kind of lay on masculinity. He's actually someone who shows what true manliness is. And I think that's what we need to be holding out to our young men. And we need mentors. Yeah. We need men to be stepping up for young boys, for people who maybe don't have that in their lives, and showing them that. Yeah,
right.
Bless you.
I just wanted to affirm you and him. So
bless you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ray. Last one, Seth.
Hi, Justin. I just wanted to thank you again for coming. I know both me and my dad have been following your podcast for a little while, and it just means a lot to get to see you in person.
You.
I wanted to get your thoughts on this, just kind of going off of what you had said earlier. We're anticipating kind of an influx of this seeker, kind of like this, what's the word there? Seeker stage, there we go, of just people coming in and sitting in and getting in the community with church like that. And depending on where they may be coming from, kind of different worldview approaches, different kind of the way that my thought with this was going right now was ethical approaches. And you get far enough with Christian ideas, with Christian belief, you get to what we deem to be good, what we deem to be right and good or not so, proceeds from God's character, right? Do you think that could be, to someone in that seeker stage, do you think recognizing God to be that when they might not have understood that before, to be a barrier to belief or not? And how might you instigate that conversation with someone in the seeker stage?
So just so I can understand the question, is it that sort of, because a lot of people are coming with kind of, I guess, ethical beliefs, maybe on sexuality, gender, or whatever, that are kind of are not in line necessarily with Scripture, that is the kind of barrier to kind of whether they can trust God. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, what I would say is that, and this is actually the third point in at the end of my book in this podcast series, is that, look, Christianity is challenging, okay? It is, and always has been, weird, actually, in the cultures where it flourished. It was weird in the first century because the way that Christians talked about and treated other human beings was completely countercultural. And many people assume the way to kind of be relevant in the 21st century culture is to kind of blend in with the culture, to kind of become invisible. But actually, the churches that are doing that are dying, actually. And in fact, I think Tom Holland, when he does go to church, he says he goes to the oldest church in London. He goes to this 900-year-old church, St. Bartholomew the Great. And he goes there because he's not looking for kind of something that already looks like the culture around him. He's looking for something different, for something that's mysterious, weird. And he uses this phrase, Justin, if you want to attract me and people like me to church, then keep Christianity weird. Because we're not interested in just having the same thing that's already on offer in culture. We want a different story. And I just think, actually, sometimes we need to have the courage of our convictions and say, actually, if we're inviting people into this, we're not going to try and just give them a warmed-over humanism that's already available in the culture. We're going to present them with the challenge of Christianity. And it is weird, and it is uncomfortable. But it also transforms people in the process. And I don't want to give people anything less than the full thing. And so, it's going to be messy. Like I say, there's going to be a lot of difficult conversations. But I honestly believe that God can cope with that. The church is the place where we're supposed to be able to deal with that and to welcome people even in all their confusion and messiness and questions and say, actually, there's a God who loves you here and he loves you just the way you are, but he doesn't want to leave you the way you are. And I just think there are lots of people who are actually looking for that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Justin, fascinating tonight. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you for watching, and thanks to First Baptist Garland in Dallas for hosting me. I wonder what you thought. Why not let me know in the comments section? Do like the video and subscribe to this channel too to be notified of more Thinking Faith conversations. And there are links with today's show to my newsletter. Subscribe today. You'll get the first chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, when you subscribe. And when you support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving, silver supporters get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also receive signed copies of both my books and a monthly catch-up call with me. Again, the links are with the info. See you next time.